everyone. Thanks for having me, Kenneth. Quite exciting. And quickly, just kind of give you some background on myself and also my experience. I come from a heavy background in entrepreneurship. I spent the last 5 years working for a local incubator accelerator known as Spring. So what is an incubator accelerator? It's basically an organization that helps support entrepreneurs who are looking to launch and grow their business. So I work with them, and in that process, we supported probably over close to 700 entrepreneurs directly. Since I joined, I worked with perhaps about 500 different companies. So we help them all the way from idea validation, help them designing their products, help them with understanding how to go out and find investors, all sorts of topics. And I think what's interesting with today's topic as well is me and Kenneth actually just participated in Start Weekend this weekend. But not only that, I've actually been quite active in quite a lot of different hackathons over the past few years. So I've been in a role where I've seen a lot of teams form from the ground up and actually turn into real companies as well. And been working very closely with a lot of really early stage companies. So kind of seeing all the different things where co-founders break up, different challenges that they face, co-founder arguments, things like that as well. So I hope to be able to share some of my knowledge and understanding around what makes good teams. And beyond early stage teams, I've actually, prior to working on ClassyNarwhal, I was working on basically a rebranded version of it. Was called value hiring. Prior to rebranding into ClassyNarwhal, I was actually working with a lot of HR professionals doing company culture consulting. So that's where I was working with companies, helping them shape culture for their organization, where they're focused on attracting people based on values. So I got to kind of see the difference in recruitment practices. How do they screen candidates? How do they interview for candidates? So I hope to be able to bring some of the knowledge into today's topic as well. So yeah, I think that's a bit about me. I by no means think that I'm a successful entrepreneur yet. I'm still on the journey as with many of you as well. So hopefully I'll be able to come back some other day and speak again and actually say, hey, you know what? Now I'm actually more successful. So always welcome any input from the crowd. If you guys have your own suggestions, your own topics, feel free to chime in. I want to make this more of a discussion as well. So feel free to ask questions at any time. I do notice that I tend to speak quite quickly. So Kenneth, maybe just cut me off if people have a question. Don't feel awkward if you have to interrupt. Cool. So key things I hope to go over today. It is a bit more of a presentation, less of a storytelling. I want to kind of talk a bit about understanding the role of a co-founder, and then we'll go into how to find one when we look at different things like traits of a co-founder, where to find them, and then lastly, we'll wrap it up by talking a bit about how to compensate co-founders, because that's a common topic I commonly get. So I think that's what we'll cover. So I know Kenneth put up the poll, who's looking for co-founder, and I know that a few people responded. So Melanie said she's looking, and then who did that? Dennis was looking for a CTO. But yeah, I'm curious to hear if anyone else is looking for co-founders. Someone has a question, I think. Sorry, Kenneth, I'll let you deal with the questions because it's hard for me to switch the screens.
Okay, we'll do the Q&A session later after the presentation, and you can do the, if you have questions, you can go to our Slido and input our event code, which is SG Richmond BC, and then you'll go to our events Slido page to ask for the questions. We'll do the Q&A session and ask the questions one by one of them. And then we can also turn on your video or audio during that time, and you can personally ask them as well.
Great. Thanks, Mikhail, Daniel, Annie, and Monty for chiming in. So yeah, it looks like quite a few people are looking for co-founders. So maybe I'll kind of skip this as a question, but I think typically when a lot of entrepreneurs come to me and say, hey, I'm looking for a co-founder, there are a lot of different challenges around that. Some of them don't know where to find them. Some of them don't quite know how to convince people to join their teams. Some people struggle with getting the right fit. Sometimes people join and then they leave. So I hope to be able to address some of that today. But quickly on a high level, let's kind of cover some basics. I'm going to kind of breeze through some of these points. I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page. We kind of all understand, what is the importance of a co-founder and how they actually add value to a team. So very obviously, it is definitely possible to start a company as a solo founder. That's actually what I'm doing right now. I'm working on my own company, ClassyNarwhal. I am pretty much a solo founder, but it is definitely a lot more challenging. You can still succeed, but it's going to be a lot more challenging. There are workarounds around that. So if you are a solo founder and you don't have team members, you still want to be able to try to leverage your network and actually try to make use of advisors or mentors in your network as well. But on the co-founder team, of course, the more the merrier, typically, but I'll talk a bit about the ideal number in a bit.
Hey, Chin, maybe you want to do a screen share with your Power Slide PowerPoint tab, so okay. The whole screen, because we can see your looks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see how to do that. Give me a quick second.
You can choose screen share your specific tab.
Application window.
Or you can use our slide in the system, and then you can still open that.
I think I got it.
You got it? Okay, that's good.
Is that full screen for you?
Yeah, it's full screen now. It's perfect.
Great. Well, you get to see all my dirty secrets. Nothing that's a secret here.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so yeah, the thing that you see with a lot of startups and their ideas is a lot of people tend to prioritize focusing on having good ideas. And a lot of people feel that usually startups fail because they run out of money. While some of those things are true, normally what you normally find with a lot of companies is a lot of startups will persist even if they run out of ideas. Their ideas might evolve, markets might change. But at the end of the day, the key thing that really grounds and holds people together is the team. Because what you normally hear as an adage to that is they don't say that startups fail, they say that founders get a job, right? So normally a lot of things can change, but if people are really passionate about a project, then usually your startup might still survive for a much longer time. So then, of course, there's other questions around like when's the right time to give up, so we can talk about that later. But it helps to find people who are really, really passionate about your idea, because given the challenges that you will face as a startup, having the right people around you, that's where not only will the company survive, but that's where you get your motivation from as well. The startup curve, some of you might have seen this graphic before. Normally, it's quite exciting to start something new. And what you typically find is a lot of founders, co-founders, and early team members, when they get into the mode of thinking, okay, I'm joining something new, I'm trying to work on a new passion project, I'm trying to change the world for the better, it is really, really exciting at the start. And then once you realize that there are actually a lot of challenges, that comes crashing down really, really quickly. And then you see this is what we call the trough of sorrow, which is the period of time when you're trying really hard to get those initial customers. And then you start to see those wiggles of hope where you sometimes get some customers and then you struggle a bit and then different things happen. And then eventually you get to a place where, okay, now I know I'm on a stable, path to growth. So the nice thing about having a team around you is it helps kind of flatten that curve as well, so to speak. So it gives you that emotional support. Your team members can help push and challenge you. And sometimes it's good to have people around you who really believe in your mission and don't just think that you're crazy as well. So why find a co-founder? Very obvious things. There's too much to do. Often we have too little time. Sometimes we don't have all the skills. But it's also really nice to just have someone to bounce ideas off and to have someone who can actually hold you accountable. So stating the obvious here, but the key thing is a lot of people, when they think about a co-founder, is they tend to focus on the skill aspect of things. They tend to say, hey, you know what? I can't do the tech piece. Maybe I need a tech co-founder. But at the end of the day, I want to quickly remind you all that a good co-founder should add a lot more value, and it's not just about bringing skills to the table. So, if you're questioning the stats, quite obviously, solo companies actually take a bit longer to scale. But it's again questionable if you really want to build a high growth, high scale company. That's neither here nor there. That different people have different preferences. So you can build a hyper growth company. You can build a very good and stable lifestyle company as well if you want to. There's no right or wrong answer. Just kind of find a fit that's good for yourself. But But if you do decide that you want to build the type of company that will grow, become a global company, and possibly even attract investors, it makes a lot of sense to have a founding team. And the reason why is because if an investor comes to you and they know that you don't have team members, usually that's a risky point for them, because, God forbid, if something happens to you, then your money is going to vaporize, right? If you get into an accident, if something happens, then the business basically fails because no one is leading the business. But if they know that there are co-founders, then it's de-risking that opportunity. So normally that's what investors are thinking when they say, okay, I sometimes will only invest in teams. I won't invest in solo founders. And obviously, higher chances of success. I'm not going to read the slides, but you get the sense there. I will use some terms in this presentation, but I want you to remember that this applies to not only tech companies, but it also applies to non-tech companies as well. So for example, when I say technical roles or technical co-founder or tech co-founder, that can also apply to, let's say, if you're running a food business, that tech co-founder for you would be your chef. Or if you're running a service business where you're providing, let's say, consulting services, the tech person is the one who has the knowledge to do the delivery. Make sense? So just kind of quickly touching on that. So maybe let's just jump right into how to find one. So the magic number. So when it comes to finding a co-founder or building co-founding teams, having too much is also a bad thing, but you do want to have some diversity in the room. So a good number is usually, I'd say about 3 people in the room. The reason why is because if you have 2 people, sometimes you need a tiebreaker to come in and give a different opinion. But if you have anything more than 4 people on a co-founding team, then you start to get too much opinions, right? Like they say, too many chefs in the kitchen doesn't make for a good meal. So having too many opinions, drags out time. There's a lot of discussion meetings, sometimes maybe even some politics, some ego that comes into play. So you just want to be mindful about how many people you put into your team. So you're really looking for diversity in terms of skills, but you're also looking for diversity in terms of the sort of responsibilities that you can delegate to as well, so that there's not too much overlap. You don't want everyone to just be doing sales, nor do you want everyone to do tech only as well. What I commonly see, and this is, if anything, that's the biggest takeaway that you can take away from today's session, is don't go out and look for co-founder. So it's actually kind of contrary to what I'm talking about in this topic. So it's how to find an ideal co-founder. And the challenge is a lot of people, when they go out and they say, hey, I'm looking for a CTO, I'm looking for a product person, I'm looking for a co-founder, that actually puts a lot of expectation on the people that are on the receiving end. It's kind of like if you go out on dates and you're saying, hey, I'm looking to get married and I want to have 2 kids and a dog, right? So a lot of heavy expectation there. So try to actually avoid using the word co-founder if you can, because if someone is hearing, okay, I want you to join as a co-founder, then right away they're thinking, oh, does it mean I have to quit my job? Does it mean that I have to lead this company? Does it mean that I have to actually have a say in every business decision that's being made? So it is quite a heavy thing. So, and that will naturally actually lead to a lot of pressure, and you get into those kind of environments where co-founders end up breaking up. So obvious reasons why they don't break up, working styles don't match, different values and vision. Sometimes if you're going into a relationship with someone who you already know, so maybe, for example, you're starting a company with your spouse or friend, sometimes it can be a bit awkward to call out different, challenging topics, or maybe even challenging their opinions if you feel like you don't want to hurt their feelings. And of course, the equity piece comes up quite often as well. So you just want to be mindful, because these are people that you'll be working for quite a long time. And these type of situations where you end up into having to navigate those co-founder breakups, it can actually be very damaging for the business, because it's going to distract the business. You're going to find that the business is going to be focused less on the customers, more on dealing with the team. And then you're going to have a lot of issues around decision making as well. If you have too many different opinions, then it's going to slow down how you make good business decisions. And it really is demotivating. So just be kind of mindful with who you enter into this relationship with. So how do you do it right? What I like to say is, try not to use the word co-founder. You want to start by actually kind of managing expectations. And a good way to do it is to actually say that, hey, I'm looking for a team member. So the keyword there is you want to use the word team member instead of co-founder. And when you say it that way, it becomes a lot more natural, and you can actually talk a bit about what a team member is. what's involved in joining as a team member, and you can talk about and go into different creative ways for compensation as well. So I'll cover that in a bit. But the idea is you want to try to do due diligence with the person. You want to try to get to know them better. You want to get to know, their values. You want to get to know what their vision is. You want to know what their work styles, work ethic is. If they have a preference in, let's say working Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, or do they like to work all day every day? So even these kind of small things will kind of affect the relationship as well. Because like it or not, I've seen a lot of CEOs and founders say, hey, you know what? I'm really cool if my team member is a working mom and needs to spend time with the kids and needs to clock out at 5 p.m. every day. So I've seen founders say that, but when push comes to shove, when they actually execute in the business, if you are working all day every day and you see that your partner is actually only putting in 40 hours a week, sometimes there's going to be that discrepancy. You're going to feel that, hey, I'm doing a lot more. Why am I giving part of my company away to this co-founder? And the opposite happens as well. So sometimes I see people who they themselves want to build a lifestyle business. They want to build something that is 9 to 5, gives them the flexibility to work around that. But then they bring on board a co-founder that's a super hustler, right? Likes to work all day, all the time. And then they'll feel that it actually makes them feel inadequate, that they're actually having that pressure and that people are actually expecting a lot more out of them. So sometimes you just want to be a bit mindful of even the work ethic as well. So at the end of the day, when you start this relationship with a person, if it goes sour, of course, it's much easier to let go of them if they're not attached to the idea that they are a co-founder. But then when you start, let's say, bringing them on as a co-founder, it's much easier to promote them rather than demote them, right? Make sense? So I'm going to quickly check the chat just to see if there are any interesting questions there. Find mentors, cool. I'll try to talk about finding mentors as well. I'm just going to take a note of that. Great. So, yep, it is a discussion around finding an early team member. So one actually great example that we saw while I was working at Spring is there's this company called BrightKit. They were actually acquired about 5 years ago, I think, by Hootsuite. And BrightKit, basically what they did is they created social media campaigns. So now they're actually known as Hootsuite campaigns. And when Richard was actually working with us to find a co-founder, he was in the process of interviewing this guy named Chris. And Chris, he came in to actually share his story. He is also an entrepreneur himself, but he comes from a tech background. So at the time when Richard was interviewing Chris, he actually wanted to make Chris his technical co-founder. So he actually knew after meeting Chris right away, he was like, okay, this is the guy, I want him to be my CTO. But what he actually did is we actually suggested that he not rush into it. So he sat down, we talked, we kind of created a kind of compensation package and some job offer package. And Richard ended up bringing Chris on board as a product lead instead of as a CTO. And that's kind of how Chris started. And what happened is after about 6 months, Chris ended up actually becoming promoted into the CTO role. And when we had Chris actually share his experience from his lens as well, he actually preferred that we actually did it this way. Because in his case, he felt that if he was asked to join as a CTO right off the bat, it would have probably chased him away. He would have probably felt that it was too much pressure, and he felt that he wasn't up to the task. So, having the chance to work with Richard for a bit as a product person first, kind of getting to know the vision of the company, how the company runs, and then after that, coming up with a lot of ideas on how he could contribute as a CTO, that made him a lot more comfortable as well. So I just want to kind of give that example because when you think about bringing on board someone on, you sometimes have the feeling that, hey, if I'm bringing this person on and I'm expecting a lot from them, maybe like I have to do it in this certain way. Maybe I have to give them the CTO role or title. But at the end of the day, you have to also think from their perspective. They sometimes prefer not to jump right into things as well. So let's talk about what makes a good co-founder or team member. So as you're thinking about a team member, maybe I want to give some time for everyone to reflect a bit. What do you think in your situation, because everyone has a different situation, and I don't want to give one-size-fits-all type of advice. What are you looking for in your co-founder? What kind of values do you want them to have? What skills do you need them to have? What do you hope that they can bring to the table? what sort of experience is necessary right now to solve your current problems as well. So maybe take some time, reflect on this. I'm going to put myself on mute. I'm going to give everyone about 2 minutes. So I was talking about hires versus contractors. So the key over there is you want to make sure that you are being mindful of how you approach it. And what I was saying is focus on, if it's a temporary solution, if it's small things, then it makes sense to bring in a contractor. If it's for something that's a bit more long-term, where you can see them evolving with the company, then you want to try to hire them. Because when you hire someone, they know that you're vested in them, and they will equally contribute because they feel that since you care about them, they can care as much about the company as well. So for example, over here is, let's say, building tech. So in some companies, if you're, let's say, needing to create, let's say, an app, and if you feel that the app is going to be fairly passive once it's done, that means once I build it, I can ignore it, then it probably makes sense to actually contract the work out and have someone develop the app for you. But if you know that, let's say, this app is kind of quote unquote an MVP, minimum viable product, and you want to evolve the platform as you bring on users, as you get different feedback, and you want to include new features, then it makes sense to bring on board a tech person in-house so that you can actually work with them and actually do quicker iterations as you actually work live. Make sense? So some quick hiring practices then, because now we're shifting our mindset. It's not so much about finding a co-founder, it's more about finding team members. This applies to bigger companies as well, not only small companies. The idea is you want to hire slow, but fire fast. Take your time with screening people. There's nothing wrong with that, because at the end of the day, if you hire too quickly, if you bring on board someone too quickly, there's going to be a lot more costs that you don't see when it comes to actually trying to deal with letting them go and finding someone else new as well. So people don't realize that, sure, you might, let's say if you hire someone in a month or so, and then if they have to, let's say, leave after 3 months or maybe even 6 months, I'd say anything less than 2 years, you find that the cost is quite high to replace them, because you have to find someone new, you got to recruit again, maybe it's going to take some time to fill the position again, you got to backfill in that moment, and then when you bring them on, you have to train them, onboard them, go through all of that. So all of that time as well is cost, because there is monetary cost associated with time. Another thing to keep in mind is when you're hiring, a lot of people tend to down hire. So they tend to hire people who they feel they can manage. That's not the right approach. And of course, if you're looking for a co-founder as the end goal, you should try to really up hire. You want to hire people who are better than you. You want to bring on board people who know more about this specific topic than you do. So you're looking for these sort of what we call A players, right? If you start to hire B people who are lower than you, eventually B people will hire C people will hire D people, and you get an organization where your frontline workers, your customer service people are all Z people. And that's kind of the worst situation to end up in. So at the end of the day, make sure that you're bringing on board people who are better than you, and you want to be able to respect their decisions and not just micromanage them. Last piece is, if always at all possible, you want to try to survive as much as you can. So a great analogy that I heard from John Chan, who runs the Growth Hackers meetup, is you want to try to be a cockroach, not a unicorn. A lot of unicorns out there, and you're actually seeing them explode or implode in this current situation now, is they focus so much on growth, they focus so much on scaling, growing their company, but you realize that with growth also comes a lot of burn, right? So you hire people, they are on payroll, so very quickly you're going to see that your money is going to dry up very quickly if you can't get more sales or if you can't get investors. So it's better to be persistent, have a small team, be creative with how you work, and kind of see what comes out of that and slowly grow steadily. So considerations then is, when you're thinking about hiring, the first thing to do is, as you work towards launching your company, what can't you do? What are the important tasks, and who can you find to actually fill in those shoes? Do you need what we call inside or outside help? So does it need to be in-house, or can you possibly contract it out? Is it temporary? Is it permanent? Is it long-term? What kind of company culture do you want to build? And company culture is super important to start thinking now on day one, because when it comes to building company culture, the first 50 employees will set company culture. Once you go beyond 50 employees, it's really, really difficult for you to change your company culture because it's already ingrained. And if you don't do it intentionally, you'll end up in a situation where you're trying to fix company culture, and that can be really, really difficult because it's actually much easier to just fire people and rehire rather than actually try to get existing people to build new patterns of behavior and acknowledge and embrace some of these new cultural changes that you want to put in. So just kind of keep that into consideration and think about it as soon as you start to think about building a team. Capital, you're thinking about revenue versus expenses. So you just want to make sure that you have enough cash flow to support bringing on additional team members. So normally what I like to see a lot of startups do is, if they're thinking about building a team, yes, product is important, tech people are important, or when I say tech, again, remember, it's not only for tech companies, but what I tend to give as advice is the best co-founders to bring on board or best early team members to bring on board is usually early team members who can contribute towards increasing revenue. So these are salespeople, marketing people, or even BD or partnerships type of people. Because if they can bring in revenue, they're basically paying for themselves, right? So just kind of keep that in mind. Screening candidates, and this is great even if you don't plan on joining or recruiting a startup, because this kind of skills that I'm going to be talking on the screening side will help you if you're looking for a job as well. So good companies, good interviewers will be transparent about the problems and challenges that the companies face. So you want to do that because a lot of hiring managers or even co-founders or CEOs, they worry about sharing all the nitty-gritty stuff because they think that it will scare people away. But that's actually a good thing. You want to scare away people who are not up to the challenge. You want to scare away people who are not a fit. And if people actually hear some of these challenges and they say, hey, you know what, I can solve this problem in this way, those are great people to bring on board, right? So don't be afraid of sharing your problems and challenges. You don't necessarily need to get them to give you an answer right away, but just by sharing some of that and asking them about their opinions, you can get some really good insight on how they like to approach problem solving as well. You want to look for people who share the same work ethic, like I mentioned before, look at how it manifests. And you also want to make sure that you feel comfortable with them, right? You want to feel that you respect them, that you actually, at the end of the day, they know more than you do, and you can actually give control to them. So that is actually a really, really good trait, especially if you want to elevate them into becoming a co-founder. They won't make good co-founders if you don't respect them, if you don't feel that they can actually make business decisions. You want to make sure that you feel comfortable talking about some awkward and challenging topics as well. So just come to the table with different interview questions so that you can really test them in different ways. When it comes to interviewing questions, there are two main types. And if you're in recruiting, you probably are aware of this. There's behavioral interviews and there's situational interviews. So behavioral questions are typically questions where you hear people asking, tell me about a time when you did this. Like, what happened? What do you do? They are great for asking, for assessing values, attitude, mindset. And there's a framework that I'll go into called the STAR framework to use it. Situational questions, they're good in certain instances. They're good for testing technical knowledge. But the challenge with that is, of course, because you're asking questions like, what would you do if, or how would you do this? These are all theoretical, right? It's good for assessing skills, but at the end of the day, you don't know if they will actually do it. So the best indicator of future performance is past performance. So the idea is you want to kind of mix it up and you want to ask some behavioral and some situational questions just to both ensure that they're actually doing what they say that they will do, and they actually have the right skills, knowledge, and experience that you need as well. So the STAR framework, what that looks like is it's a framework for you to listen for answers. When you're asking people those behavioral interview questions, you're asking them like, hey, tell me about a time when you last had to deal with a difficult customer, for example. When they respond to you, you want to listen for the S, which is the situation. So what exactly was the context for what happened? What was their task? What were they supposed to do? What was the action? What did they do? What were the results that came out of that? So what actually happened? And lastly, what are the lessons that they learned? So that's kind of the bonus as well. A lot of people tend to stop at S, T, and A. So they'll talk about the situation, they'll talk about the task, they'll talk about what they did, but they won't actually talk about the results, and they won't actually talk about what they actually learned coming out of it. So your goal as you're interviewing or screening people is to really prod them to figure out like, how did that actually impact the results? What actually came out of it? What do you learn from that? So that really helps you understand them in more depth. Where to find them? So Personally, I'm biased. One of my favorite places to find team members is actually hackathons. So I talked about Start Weekend, which just recently happened, and I talked about a hackathon that I run. The reason why I really like hackathons so much is when you actually join hackathons, if you're thinking about joining one, you don't want to focus on the winning aspect. I've seen a lot of great startups come up from hackathons where they actually don't win the pitch. Because again, a lot of hackathons tend to favor people who are good presenters. And that's fine, but you will see a lot of great teams that they're really good at executing, they get really good results, but sometimes they're not the best when it comes to pitching. So your goal is, if you do participate in hackathon, you want to look for people who you think share the same vision and value that you do. So that's why you actually want to try to pitch your idea. So even if some hackathons don't allow you to work on existing ideas, you want to pitch something that is similar, or you want to pitch something that is speaking to the same mission. That helps you attract people who share the same vision and share similar values as you. Second thing is, if your team is not selected, then when you join a hackathon, if you see someone that you say, hey, you know what, that guy's a developer, I want to recruit him, I think he's actually going to be a great fit because I like the way he talks, I like the ideas that he's pitching, then your goal is to actually go and join their team. And what happens is, during a hackathon, people are working in a high stress environment and they're working on big ideas. And what you get to see is, you really get to see how they work under pressure, right? So that gives you that experience of due diligence, and you get to see how they actually deal with problems, how they try to solve things in different ways. And it really helps you vet them. And coming out of that, you build a relationship with them, and it makes it a lot easier for you to recruit them coming out of it too. The next best thing, of course, is your own network. So typically, people will naturally build a network of people who are similar than compared to themselves. So it's best to share out what you're working on with your network. Don't be afraid of hiding your ideas. Share it out. Sometimes you get a lot of good feedback. You can't really ask for help unless you actually put the idea out there. So don't worry too much about people stealing your ideas. You don't have to get into the details. A lot of people worry about people stealing your ideas. You're not actually sharing how you're doing it. You're not sharing the algorithms. You can just say, hey, this is what I'm working on. This is the high level. I'm looking for people who can help me, right? So if you share your mission, your vision, the why, you'll naturally attract people who share similar mission or vision as well. Referrals. So if you already have team members, or if you have a mentor, an advisor, or an investor, tap into them. Ask them like, hey, you know what? You know me really well. Do you know someone else who can help me with this project that I'm working on? And then the next thing is, if you go down another level, is if you try to approach, let's say, business groups or meetup groups, you want to try to approach business or meetup groups that are cause-oriented. So for example, one great example is, I know Monty's on the call. Let's say, for example, if you're looking for an architect or an engineer, you might find success going into engineering-related groups. But the challenge with that is, that's a skill-oriented group. And some of them might not share the same vision. So sometimes you might end up having someone say, hey, I'm interested. And then they very quickly find out that, oh, you're a startup. You actually can't pay them the salary. And then they lose interest, right? Instead, like, for example, there's let's say Anthony, which Monty, I think you know him as well. Anthony runs this embodied carbon meetup group. So these are engineers, people who are architects in building, and they are all people who are passionate about helping create buildings that are lower in terms of carbon emission. So all these folks might share a similar mission as you do, and there is where you can probably most readily find people who are a better fit for becoming a co-founder in your team as well. Or if not, then of course they might know people in your network who might be a good fit. And then lastly, volunteers and interns. Those are also a great way to actually get good people who end up becoming co-founders. So Brienne, who works for Nada Grocery, I think I have a story coming up. So I can quickly jump to her story. So Brienne, she was a marine biologist, and she approached Spring about 4 years ago before she even opened up the grocery store. So they now actually have a physical location on Broadway and Fraser. And when they approached us about, actually, I think 5 years ago now, she just pitched an idea. She said, hey, I want to start a grocery store with no packaging. It's been done before. It's been done in Belgium. It's been done in Texas. But I don't know if Vancouver is ready for it. So we said to her, hey, why don't you test it out? Why don't you go out and actually, instead of leasing a location, buying a whole bunch of product and trying to sell it, why don't you write down some of your assumptions and test them out methodologically? So one of her first MVPs was actually creating a Facebook page. So she created the Zero Waste Vancouver group. So that Facebook page was a page where people could go on and share tips and tricks around how to live a lifestyle with minimal waste. And the page really quickly grew to 3,000 people. Now it's actually 10,000 people now. But that's actually how she started the community and attracted the right people, both customers and also co-founders. Eventually, she got some of her best volunteers from the group. And actually, one of her volunteers, Allison, is actually now her COO. So Allison started as a volunteer. She eventually became an employee, and then Brianne elevated her to becoming a COO just because she was so passionate and she could really bring a lot of good value to the company. So that was kind of how she used the closed Facebook group to build that. The other assumption that she was testing, just to give you a bit more color in her story, is she wasn't sure if people will actually put their money where their mouth is and actually have that sort of purchasing behavior. Sure, people say they want to buy things in a more environmentally friendly way, but when they actually have to buy their groceries, will they actually bring their own Tupperwares? Will they bring their own containers? So that's kind of where you see in this image over here, she's doing a pop-up location in Patagonia. So she actually she actually approached the store manager and said, hey, is it okay if I try to sell some product in your store over a weekend and see if people will buy it? And surprisingly, the manager said yes. And that's actually how she started. She actually built it up with her pop-up shops. And it got to a stage where every weekend she'd be making about, I think, more than $3,500 a weekend. And that was just maxed out because there's only so many people she could serve at a time because of the limited amount of space and limited amount of products that she could carry. But it allowed her to really build that initial demand for customers. And also it helped her test different products to figure out, like, hey, what products, what do I need to think about how I package them? How do I present them? What do I need to tell people to bring in order to buy these products? So it gave her a lot of good insight as well. So you can see how even if you want to open up a very expensive business like a grocery store, you can actually start really small. And just to give you some numbers, before COVID hit, I know that she was making about $2 million in revenue from her retail store. I don't know how the situation is right now, but like you can see, like that's $2 million in revenue from pretty much zero in only about 5 years, right? So don't be afraid of like starting small, and you can start very manually as well. I'll give another quick example, and then maybe I'm going to kind of breeze through the rest. So this is another great example. So Jennifer here, and I know that she's came on to Startup Grind as a speaker as well. Jennifer started with Spring about 6 years ago. When she actually started, she was a solo founder as well. She actually came to us and she said, hey, I have this idea. I'm really good at making jewelry. And one of my jewelry lines was actually carried by Lady Gaga. So she actually had this necklace that Lady Gaga won on stage and sold a whole bunch for. And she said, hey, I want to start this jewelry company. And very quickly, her idea ended up pivoting, and she realized that she was actually really good at getting influencers. So I remember meeting her in 2014 at Startup Weekend, where she was actually pitching this idea for this pivot that she was attempting to do. So she said, hey, I want to build this platform where we will try and recruit influencers and companies and put them on the same platform so that companies can find the best influencer for the products. So at the time, she was doing it before the influencer was even a word. And that's actually how she ended up forming her initial team. So Andre, who is the guy in the red t-shirt in the left, he actually joined that Startup Weekend with Jennifer. He was on the team with her as well. And then the team did not end up winning. But what happened was she found some key members who actually stayed with the company for quite a while. So Andre was one of those. He actually is still with the company right now. And when she actually started and launched one of her MVPs, a minimum viable product, was instead of building that platform, she actually built a simple website that just said, hey, we connect brands with influencers. If you're a brand and you're looking for an influencer for your products, contact us. And she would jump into the call once someone contacted them and say, hey, you know what? Great, I'd love to learn more about what influencer you're looking for. Tell me about some details, and then I'll put all that information into our system, and the algorithm will automatically find you the best match on the internet, right? Of course, at the time, all of that didn't exist. The algorithm was basically her head. So she would go on Google, she would do all the research herself, and then she would say, okay, based on our algorithm, these are the top 5 influencers in your market. And very quickly, that's kind of how she started getting her initial customers. She actually got to about $25,000 in revenue just off that simple landing page alone. And that's actually how she recruited her technical CTO. So Steven is actually the guy who's behind Andre, the small guy on the top left. And when Steven joined, he was actually not allowed to write any code for the first 3 months. Jennifer just had Steven shadow her and look at how she was going out and trying to do all that research manually and find the best influencer for a company. And that's kind of how Steven actually knew what to build and how to automate things without creating a lot of noise. Because you have to remember, when it comes to tech, especially like actual tech, tech is an amplifier. It'll amplify the good things, but it'll also amplify a lot of the bad things as well. So for example, if you have a process where you call, let's say 10 people and you close 2 customers. And if you say, okay, I'm going to automate the process so that now I can either bring on more people and they can call a lot more people, and let's say I can call 1,000 people, now you're closing 200 people. But if you find out that, oh, actually, you know what, that list is not the right list, and if I call a different list of 10 people, I can actually close 8 out of 10. And if you automate that, then you actually amplify a lot more good things rather than creating a lot of noise. So the idea is when you think about automation and tech, you want to make sure that you go about it after you've actually tested things manually, just to make sure you know what's actually working well and what will be effective. So I'm going to jump through this, and I think I'm just going to, I talked about the hackathon, so I'm not going to cover that too much. But maybe let's jump into compensation, and then we can go to Q&A. So compensation, the key thing here to remember is, even though you're not bringing them on board as co-founders and you're saying that, hey, I want to hire them as a team member, it doesn't mean that you only need to compensate them with money, right? You can still be creative with how you mix and match things. So you can give them minimal money, or maybe you can even say like, hey, you know what? We'd love to hire you. We are a startup. We actually can't pay you, but this is what we can do. We'll set up a revenue share agreement. We'll give you some equity. You can mix and match and be creative with how you do it. So a friend of mine, Steven, he was working for this company called Inkpat Studios. They're a Vancouver-based company, and they were actually a video gaming creation company. So they would actually bring people together to work on building new games. And one of the ways that they would do it is all the people joining this team and creating games, they would actually pitch an idea. And what they would do is they would say, okay, if you have a great idea for a game, we will go out and find team members to work on building your game together with you. But all these team members that join, they would not be paid employees. They would actually all sign on to a revenue share agreement where whatever money that game makes, they would actually split the profits depending on the amount of work that they put in as well. So that's kind of how they did it. And they actually were able to recruit a lot of really amazing engineers and tech people to actually work on building these games. They found designers, things like that as well. So don't be afraid of not being able to compensate with money. But you have to be super clear with expectations and make sure that people really understand the risk that's involved and are comfortable with that, right? So equity, commission, revenue share, these are all just different ways to kind of word it. I prefer using the word revenue share rather than commission, because revenue share feels like you're in it together. Commission just feels like, hey, you do what you get and you're just like a paid contractor kind of thing. You can also explore strategic partnerships. So let's say, for example, if you need, let's say, tech, and you can help people with marketing, maybe they need help with marketing, so you can do some service exchange as well. At the end of the day, make sure you get it all formalized, because if anything does go sour, you want to make sure that you can fall back on agreements just to make sure that things are black and white. So equity, I'm going to quickly choose sound, or is everything good? Okay. So equity is a big pain point for a lot of small teams. I generally find that when it comes to that, this is really awkward, and a lot of people feel quite uncomfortable talking about who gets how much. So a quick reminder, which is it's much better to have a small slice of a big pie than a big slice of nothing, right? Don't worry too much about it. The key word with equity is fairness. You want to make sure that people perceive they're getting a good exchange. So it's not about you winning this discussion. It's not about you, okay, I am getting X amount and like that's what they deserve. If you bring them on board and they don't, even if they agree to terms, if they're actually not happy with it, they won't actually be good co-founders. So the goal is to create a good sense of fairness. So there's no perfect kind of split equity. You should to motivate people. Equity is not a good management tool. So I see talk about like like, hey, you will get your equity if you hit certain milestones. Milestones like that should be managed. Equity is just really to motivate people to go above and beyond. So when it does come to co-founders, so if you do enter into a real co-founder relationship, you have to know as well what the norm is. So most co-founders, they don't split everything 50-50, right? Most co-founders usually get about 10 to 20% in terms of equity, especially if you're a company where you're thinking about growing into a hyperscale company, where you plan to raise money from investors, you plan on going global, maybe even going public someday. It is more normal for you to get about 10 to 20%. So the reason why that is because as you raise capital or as you bring in other co-founders, you will naturally dilute the amount of capital you have, and that 10 to 20 is kind of the norm in the industry. So if you go out to an investor and say, hey, you know what, I brought up this co-founder and owns 20% of the company, but he owns 40%, the investor's also going to look at you and be like, what, this doesn't seem right, and they might get scared away as well. ESOP, so that's employee stock option plan. So normally if you bring about early employees before they actually become a co-founder, they typically get a small percentage. So it's usually about 1 to 2.5%. And the right way to word that is you don't want to just say, hey, I'm giving you 1 to 2% of my company, because that doesn't sound like a lot. It's better to just say, hey, I'm giving you X amount of shares, and that equates to how many percentage. So you just have to make sure that you set the right expectation. Same with advisors as well. Advisors is usually 0.1%, so that it's actually very, very low, to 2.5%. And at 2.5 is if you have someone really amazing as, let's say, like Mark Zuckerberg is one of your advisors, sure, you them 2%. But the idea is you want to know what the norm is so that you don't end up giving away too much, nor giving away too little. And I want to quickly kind of talk about how to divide equity. Yeah. So not so much for employee stock options, but more for co-founders. Normally, the main ways of dividing it is that's the traditional way, and that's what they call slicing pie. So just be mindful about how you approach it. So the traditional way is typically there are many different ways of calculating it, and you can actually use the link there. So I'll send you the slides, and you can kind of see some of these resources. But people will typically divide based on roles or what they can bring to the table. And usually each co-founder will get anywhere from, like I mentioned, 10 to 20%. Slicing pie, on the other hand, is a different and new methodology where basically you allocate equity based on performance or contribution. So what they do is there's a specific, like a spreadsheet that you can fill out, and every week you'll log like your time or your contribution. And basically at the end, you have a mix where you don't have to give equity just based on trust, but you're actually giving equity based on what people are actually doing. So that's kind of the premise behind slicing pie. There are pros and cons. So it's nice because there are clear guidelines to start with. It accounts for monetary contributions more readily, and it kind of prevents founders from being lazy and just kind of wait for equity to vest. So if you're not familiar with vesting and how that works, basically the kind of fail-safe behind the traditional way is people will say, okay, I'm going to give you equity, but it's vested. And it's vested usually over 4 years. So what happens is you don't get all the equity right now. So you are entitled to 20% of the company, for example, but you only get it after 4 years of staying with the company. So normally how the vesting schedule works is because it's 4 years, the first year is usually a cliff. That means in the first year, if we're not a fit, we can kick you out of the company and you don't actually own anything. But after a year, you actually lock down 25% of the 20%. So you actually lock down 5%. And then after 2 years, you lock down 10%. After 3 years, you lock down 15%. After 4 years, you get the full 20%, right? So it just allows you to buy back the equity from them if they're actually not a good fit, if they don't do things well. But the slicing pie method kind of prevents those lazy founders who just sit in the company and wait for equity to vest. It's dynamic, so it kind of prevents unfair allocation, and it addresses co-founder departures as well. So that's a nice thing about slicing pie. I'm personally not a big fan of slicing pie because I feel that it somewhat overcomplicates things. And the challenge is when you're doing this type of tracking to kind of decide how much and who gets how much equity, the challenge there is it brings up the equity discussion more often than it needs to be happening. And it can sometimes be a bit distracting because then people will feel like equity is such a big topic and they focus less on actually doing stuff for the business, and sometimes they try to just justify why they should get how much equity. So just kind of be mindful of how you approach it. So yeah, there are pros and cons. Find a different model. I've seen some companies where they start with slicing pie and then they transition to a more traditional approach. Or sometimes, like I say, if you really trust a person, then you can just go with the traditional way. Like at the end of the day, you shouldn't be entering into a relationship with a possible team member or co-founder if you don't trust them to begin with. So yeah, make sure you set expectations on day one, right? So just to avoid a lot of this equity kind of debates that happen. A lot of people have these challenges because they don't have the right expectation. They feel like, oh, you know what, I'm entitled to this amount of this percentage of the company. If we raise capital, I shouldn't be diluted, things like that. So make sure you actually sit them down with a good startup lawyer to actually talk about how equity works. What are some of the tax implications of having equity? When do I offer equity? How to do that, things like that. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. We can talk about that in Q&A if you have more questions. And yeah, at the end of the day, just recognize as well, like equity, it's a motivating factor, but it isn't really worth much unless you actually sell your company or unless you actually go public. And in most cases, that usually takes about 7 to 10 years. So most founders won't actually see anything come out of having equity, right? So at the end of the day, focus more on execution and don't think too much about debating about who owns how much. I'm going to skip over this. And I think I'm just going to kind of touch on the key takeaways and then we can go to Q&A. So key takeaway, don't focus on using the word co-founder, focus more on team members. Focus on finding people who can really respect you. Those are good co-founders. Those are people who can call you out on your bullshit. And focus on value and culture fit over skills. Cognitive diversity helps give you a lot of creativity in your organization as well. And if you're using interview questions, you think about the STAR framework, right? Situation, task, action, and results. What actually came out of that? And the bonus behind that is what did they learn from it as well. And yeah, just be mindful that you can be very creative with compensation, right? Treat people the way they want to be treated. So that's another key thing there. So you want to ask them how they want to be compensated. Don't just give them what you think they want. Actually ask them what they want. And if all else fails, if you really can't attract people, sales is probably the best thing that you can do. Because like I mentioned with Jennifer, remember she was actually selling her product. She actually had revenue, she had customers even before they built any tech into it, right? And there's this great article that I read as well about another company where they went out, they actually did a whole bunch of sales, pieced everything together on the back end manually with a whole bunch of different tools. And at the end of the day, if you get customers and customers are willing to pay, when you speak to, let's say, a technical person, maybe even a chef or something like that, if you're actually telling them that, hey, this is not just an idea that I have, I'm actually running it, I actually have customers, I have people who want this product, then it will better motivate them to join you as well. So I think that is all for my topic. I'm going to jump to Q&A now.
Okay, so we'll go with the first one then.
Based on what I've seen, top attributes that make up an ideal co-founder. So if you're looking for someone who is really that fit for becoming a co-founder down the road, attribute would be, I mean, first and foremost, I've covered it in the talk, people who really align and share the same vision or mission. And then the next most important thing would be the values. If you're talking about more softer attributes, then I'd say people who are creative problem solvers, people who like to actually face many different challenges. They're not afraid of actually being rejected or not being afraid of failure. These are really good traits because as a startup especially, you're typically going to fail quite a lot. You're going to run into a lot of challenges. I hope that kind of answered the question. I think skills, it really depends on what you need done. So I'm not going to really touch too much on that. What is the current market demand like? More startup founders looking for a technical founder or the reverse? The current market, I'd say, is there are a lot of technical people, especially here in Vancouver or anywhere on the West Coast, I'd say. A lot of tech people generally. So because there are so many tech people, what you're finding is a lot of them will actually prefer to work for bigger companies, especially if they're fresh graduates. So typically the best, I'd say, in terms of finding a person who would join a startup is you want to find someone who's actually been employed or been working for a company for a few years. So these are people usually around like 25, 26, 27 years old because they have some money in their pockets. They're not trying to pay off their student debt. and they're usually a bit restless working in corporate, and they want to try something new. So that's kind of what I would try to look for. But I'd say definitely there are probably a lot more tech people out there than there are founders. But then again, there's a lot of big companies also looking for these tech talents as well. Next question, what we say are the biggest pain points when looking for a co-founder? The biggest would probably be people just jumping to saying they're looking for a co-founder. The challenge I see a lot with a lot of other types of co-founders that people are looking for is when they're going out, they don't have a large network. So they pretty much have to build from scratch, and they're hoping that they can get a co-founder within 1 or 2 months. So if you look at how teams typically recruit, the best way, if you really want to find a co-founder in the truest sense of the word, these are people who come up and start a company with you at the very inception. That means they come up with the idea with you together, right? So most cases, when you're looking for a co-founder, you already have a company or you already have an idea. So in a sense, they're not really a co-founder. They're more like an early employee. So if you want to find people who come up with ideas together with you, then hackathons are great for that. But usually otherwise, if you're finding those early team members, it does take some amount of time. So people tend to have very high expectations in terms of like, hey, I need to try to find a co-founder in 2 or 3 months or else I can't work on this idea. And usually it takes at least about 6 months to get a co-founder. And that's really because sometimes you just need to build the network, you need to find the right people, get to share the ideas around. What's the ideal size in founding team and what roles do they have? So I mentioned ideal size is about, I'd say, 3 to 4 people. Anything beyond that is a bit too much. What roles do they have? As you can see from some of the stats, the more diverse, the better. But typically, you will find that if you have people with sales, that's super important as one of the roles. Marketing is also big, but marketing is only relevant if you're doing more B2B. If you're B2C, it's more relevant if you're more B2C. Sales is more relevant if you're B2B. Product people, not absolutely necessary. You can start a company without product people. But then, of course, they kind of help balance things out because product people also make good co-founders because they have a very different way of solving company-related problems, not only product-related problems. They're very logical, very methodological. So yeah, product people, finance kind of helps sales and marketing. That's kind of typically what I see in a starting team. Do you recommend founders that are remote? Great question, and I think that's very relevant in this time and place now with social kind of physical distancing being a requirement. I'd say there's no harm in having founders that are remote. The key thing though is a lot of founders struggle with creating company culture if their team is remote. So I was actually recently listening to a recent Masters of Scale episode where the founder and CEO of WordPress was talking about how their team is 100% remote, even before the coronavirus hit. So in their case, he was sharing some of his tips, and he was talking about how any company, if it grows big enough, pretty much has a quote-unquote remote team, even though they're working all in the same office, right? So like Google, for example, some of their team members will actually still do video calls because it's just simply too far to walk to the next person's office. So I'd say people are more remote than you think. The idea is it's all about the experience if you're setting up company culture. So you want to make sure that the employee experience is almost as equally parallel to your customer experience. That when you recruit them, when you put out the job posting, when they apply, how do you respond to them? How do you actually talk to them about culture? When you onboard them, all of this all has to take into consideration what your values and mission are. So you just have to make sure that you actually take the time to do that. I see a lot of great companies, they focus on customer experience, but they have terrible employee experience. When employees come on board, there's no good onboarding strategy. There's no, the way they respond to applicants, the way they reject applicants are kind of not aligned with their values. So you just want to make sure that you give the same amount of attention to employee experience as you do for customer experience. What should I be looking for specifically in a technical co-founder, business co-founder? Technical co-founder, I would say, is good technical co-founders not only have the skill. If you just simply need someone to build a product for you, then you can outsource it. A good technical founder is capable of actually thinking about technical strategy. So it's more about like, how do I deal with the infrastructure of this as it scales? How do I actually lead a team and actually change and evolve the product over time? So people who actually have a bit more insight and experience does help. So it's more around like technical strategy, not so much about technical execution. Business co-founders, it depends. Typically, I'd say I try to avoid having people who have the exact same experience. And what I mean by that is, for example, if I'm looking to hire a salesperson for, let's say, an education company, it actually might make sense to actually hire someone who isn't already working for another education company doing sales. And the reason why is because if they are in the same industry, same experience, in the same role, they will tend to have very fixed habits around how to do things, and it's very hard to change their behaviors. What I instead like to look for is I like to look for transferable skills in a very similar type of role, but it's slightly different. So for example, let's say if you're recruiting for a salesperson in education, maybe finding a recruiter might be a good fit. Because if you make a recruiter a salesperson, recruiters basically do almost the same thing as a salesperson. They have to, speak with job candidates. They have to speak with companies. So in education, you're also doing something similar as well. You're speaking to people who eventually become job candidates. You're speaking to companies who want to hire your students as well. So in that case, then they have transferable skills. They'll probably make a good business co-founder. What are the more common reasons why founding partners split up? Usually difference in opinion, difference in ideas, difference in vision and values. And then equity is the second biggest one. So I think I've already addressed both of those as well. Common problems business founders are having when looking for a technical co-founder. I would say it's mostly around expectations on what can or cannot be done on the technical side. So sometimes a lot of business people think that, oh, you know what, if I hire a tech person, all these problems will go away. Usually it's not quite the case. It really depends on what is actually possible with the technology. So good business people will actually have some level of technical experience as well. They'll actually, they won't be afraid of actually going and getting their feet wet and actually learning some of the technical lingo and what's actually involved, what's possible, what's not possible. Technical co-founders, on the other hand, sometimes the common mistake that they make when they're looking for a business co-founder is that they tend to be so focused on the product that they don't really think about the business sense behind that. So the revenue model, how the business is going to grow at scale, finding investors. So the biggest challenge with technical co-founders is relinquishing control, because usually they're not the best at making this type of business decisions, and they need to be able to find someone that they can really trust will make good business decisions that actually align with their values as well. Because at the same time, you don't want to find a business co-founder who's amazing at sales, amazing at finding investors, but is finding all the wrong investors for you as well, right? Advice and best practice to ensure knowledge sharing and syncing between co-founders along the journey. Really, it's mostly on transparency and communication. So making sure that you're actually sharing all of the things that are happening in the background, even if it's personal stuff, not only business stuff as well. Because I feel that a lot of the times, sometimes, you really have to fix what's going wrong with yourself before you try to fix the business. And especially in challenging times like this, a lot of people are so focused on fixing and putting up business fires that they don't really take the time to acknowledge each other as people as well. So if you're working with a good co-founder, you want to make sure that you're actually keeping up to date, like what's going on in your life, how can I help you, and actually kind of support each other both in the journey personally, but as well as the business side of things as well. Other knowledge sharing, product management tools help. So like Trello or Asana or Basecamp, because I find a lot of people tend to, when they start working on an idea, they tend to be so focused on just executing on their deliverables that they don't really think about the bigger picture as well. So using a project management tool definitely helps with that. Sorry, I'm kind of going through very quickly. I'm just trying to make sure I get through everything. 10 to 20% equity, no, for co-founder, how to determine how much is fair. First thing I would say is, sit down with a startup lawyer, make sure that you kind of know what's normal in your industry. Depending on your type of business, it might not be the norm, right? If you're doing a retail business and you're not trying to scale hyper-growth company, maybe it's not 10 to 20%. Maybe it's normal to have 50%, right? So make sure you just speak with a lawyer for that. How do you decide? I would say it really depends on their experience and the value that they can add. So not so much about the time that they spend or the milestones. So again, like milestones, that's where you're managing for performance, and you don't want to use equity to manage for performance. So I'd say making sure that it's more oriented around what experience they have, what background, seniority, what can they bring to the table, their network, their connections, their ability to close sales, things like that. Reason why you want to avoid milestones, another example is, let's say, for example, if you say, okay, one of the milestones that we will try to do is we will try to get, let's say, $10,000 in revenue. Small milestone, but that's just an example. And if you don't hit that milestone and you bring aboard a salesperson and they're a co-founder and they say, oh, we didn't hit the milestone because you didn't deliver on the product, then it really becomes a really heated argument at a case. Then it's not they didn't hit the milestone because they didn't do a good job, but it might be you who didn't do a good job, right? So you want to try to avoid using milestones because it can really demotivate people. At the end of the day, you want to make sure you're acknowledging problems and you're focusing on people adding value as opposed to like looking at milestones. Manage for milestones, use equity for motivating. How to build culture early on and intentionally. What are the must-have questions, conversations do you recommend to discuss about culture? Questions that I like to ask include things like, why do you want to join a company, obviously? So that's one question I like to ask. I like to ask people like, if you could start your own company, what would you want to do? What company would you want to build? Or I would ask people, let's say if you retire, what do you want to be remembered for? What's the legacy that you want to have? So these kind of things help me understand sort of the mission aspect, their personal why. On the value aspect, I like to try to interview for and understand how people define values in their own sense. So for example, I might ask people like, one of the company values that we have is, let's say, growth. So I might ask someone like, hey, when it comes to growth, what are things that what do you think growth means to you? And what are things that you do to grow yourself? And then I try to see how they answer that, to try to basically understand if it aligns with my definition of growth and does it align with how I view it. I hope that helps answer that. When realizing a co-founder relationship isn't working out, how to best approach that conversation and how compensate, if any? Great question. So I'd say there's no easy way to break up with a co-founder, and these conversations will be hard. The goal is to be as transparent and as fair and as humane as possible. So when you do go about it, you want to actually say why you think it's not fair. Why it's not working out. You want to talk about how you want to try to give them some compensation in some way, depending on what you deem as fair or what the rest of the team deems as fair. So yes, you can kick people out usually within the first year if they're on a cliff, and you can actually not give them any equity. But you might just say, hey, you know what? You've actually done some great job, some great work. We don't think you're working out as co-founder because of these reasons, but we still want to give you some equity. So maybe we won't give you this percentage, but we'll give you X amount of shares. So you can definitely still do that if you want to, or you can still compensate them with money. At the end of the day, it's really all about intention. So there's no easy answer for that, unfortunately. What are some of the best team building exercises you can do with your co-founders when you're first on board the team? Very broad question. I like to try to get people to work on new problems, new ideas not related to the company, because that really helps me see how they solve problems. It helps me see their opinion, helps me see how they work under pressure. So I like to try to do like a sort of mini challenge, or even like start a new project that is maybe somewhat related to your company but not entirely related, just to kind of get them to work for you without actually making them a formal employee as well. Kind of helps you really understand them before you start to get into this relationship with them.
That looks like the last questions on Slido, but if anyone else has other questions, you can either type it in the chat box, or you can request for us to turn on your mic or video to ask the questions. Anyone?
I went through a lot today. I'm thankful for those of you who are still around, especially after the technical issues.
Yeah.
Again, if you can't ask your questions today, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I post my LinkedIn in the chat. Happy to answer questions there as well.
Yeah.
And if you want the slides, just email me or Kenneth, and we can share.
Yeah, we'll send it out. Yeah, we'll send out the slide and your LinkedIn profile on in the post-event email as well.
Right.
Okay. So no more questions. Then we'll wrap up. Okay. Thank you a lot, Chin, for sharing your experience and knowledge about how to find a co-founder and how to find the ideal co-founder. Thank you. Not sure. I think everyone else is doing it, but this is kind of like the webinar style clapping. Okay.